In the last video, Thomas over here on my right, you can see he's right next door to me. How are you doing, Thomas? Went and did an amazing job of giving us an entire scope of history, 600 to 700 years of it, all in one video. I'm sure you're all exhausted, as am I, just listening to that. But what a good way to get an encapsulation of all the geopolitical, theological disputes and debates, and also what was happening on the ground with the Persians and the Christians and the Byzantines and the Sassanids and the Hassanids and the Lakhmids, and you name it, it was done, and all the major players. And now what he's going to do, he's going to go back to the 7th century, and rather than just look at what was happening politically on the ground, he wants to now unpack what was happening theologically. He wants to look and see what were the theological groups, because there was no religion called Islam that early, and there was no real group called Muslims or a person called Muhammad who was confronting Byzantine Christianity. Not that early. There weren't even any caliphs, as he said in the last video. That name wasn't even really used until the 9th century. But certainly there were people who had theological positions. And this is quite normal. This has happened right through the last 2,000 years of the church, where we still even see that today. And especially there are people that do not like the idea that Jesus is God. I mean, look at the Jehovah's Witnesses today. That would be a prime example in the 20th century. Charles Taze Russell has created an entire sect called Jehovah's Witnesses against that idea. Islam is against that idea. So where did this anti-Trinitarian viewpoint come from? It obviously didn't spring out of the air, because this is an Arian controversy. This is what they debated back at the Council of Nacia, when Athanasius took on the Arianists back in the 4th century in 325. So certainly this is nothing new. This has been around since the 4th century. We're now in the 7th century, 300 years later, and this obviously raised its head once more. So Thomas is going to unpack that. He's going to show us what the debate that was going on within the church in that part of the world, which then led to what we know today as Islam, very much an anti-Trinitarian religion, very much an Arian religion, a religion that believed that Jesus is not God, he's nothing more than a prophet. Thomas, this will be great to have you back again. Over to you.
Oh, thanks, Jay. As you just said, I've been talking a lot about Syrian anti-Trinitarian Christians. So now it's finally time to look into it. Who were these people? Where did they come from? What did they believe? And we should go straight into our presentation, I guess. Okay, so who are these Syrian anti-Trinitarian Christians? And last time I started in the year 250. Today I'm actually starting even earlier, at the early 2nd century, because that's when we get our first glimpses into who these Syrian anti-Trinitarian Christians are, where they come from. It's still, so there aren't really any writings left, they didn't leave any behind, because they just weren't copied, and there's this survival bias, right? So what would later become the Catholic Church would obviously only copy, or mostly copy stuff that would align with their theology, and not something that they would deem heretical, right? So there's this survivorship bias. So we don't have any direct sources from the 2nd century, but we can piece together a little bit. And one way of doing it is looking at Syrian theologians of the time, even though they weren't anti-Trinitarian, but who still had this Syrian mindset, if you will, who were taught in this Syrian tradition. And one of them is, for example, the one who's on the picture right here. That's Ignatius of Antioch. He's the 3rd patriarch and bishop of Antioch after St. Peter, and he died around 115 AD. So we're really early in the church history. And even though he is not an anti-Trinitarian, there are some things that in his writings that sort of give us a hint. So, for instance, he believes very much in a theology of proving oneself. So proving oneself in the eyes of God by following in the footsteps of Jesus. So that's something that we will find out is like a very, very important part of this anti-Trinitarian belief. Also, what we see is some terms being used. So, for instance, Jesus is the servant of God. That's a title that is quite common in this early Syrian Christian community. It doesn't, but sort of disappears over time within the church, because it has this connotation: if you're the servant of God, then you can't be God. It still exists, even I think in the Bible today, but it's understood differently. It's not understood in that way. But in Syria, it would be understood as, well, he's a servant; he can't be God himself. Exactly. Also, what is typical for this Syrian Christianity is it's usually confined in small communities, and it's preachers who move around from town to town, sort of founding small little communities. These Syrian Christians, so unlike the Greeks, at this time, basically we have sort of this Syrian side of Christianity and the Greek side of Christianity, and Greek and Latin, but we're looking at the Greeks because that's the area we're in. And they both those groups have very different approaches to religion in general. So the Syrians, just like all Semitic cultures, so like the Jews, they are more oriented in history and not in the nature of God or man or the cosmos. So what do I mean by oriented in history? So God, in their view, acts in history through the prophets and through Jesus. And it is sort of your responsibility now to understand what God does and why he does it, and what does it and draw your conclusions from it. Like, what does he want from me? And Jesus now offers sort of a template. So his life is the perfect life, sort of the perfect life as God would want you to live yours. So you follow in Jesus' footsteps. You prove yourself worthy in the eyes of God, right, by following in Jesus' footsteps. And that's how salvation is achieved in this Christology. So it's not by the sacrifice of Jesus or by his incarnation or anything like that. It's by proving yourself worthy, by following in Jesus' footsteps. So they are anti-Trinitarian and strictly monotheistic. So they reject this idea of a Trinity. Although, all of what I said, it's still quite blurry at the beginning of the 2nd century, right? But we actually do get a better picture with this guy. So on this picture you see, this is a 18th century rendition of Paul of Samosata. And he is one of our best sources for this anti-Trinitarian Christianity. He was actually the Bishop of Antioch he was made Bishop of Antioch in 258. And at that time, the Bishop of Antioch was one of the highest positions that you could have in Christendom, right? So there was, maybe the Pope was already slightly above him, like the Pope in Rome, but then basically it was already the Bishop in Antioch. That was one of the most important Christian communities, and hence their bishop was one of the most important figures. So I think at that time was basically 3 cities. It was Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria. Those 3 bishops were made up the highest ranking church officials, if you will. I mean, it wasn't really like a church structure as we know it today, but people would look up to them, and they would have their voice would have a lot of weight. However, he was denunciated at 2 synods in Antioch, once in 264 and 268 for his Christology. So that tells us 2 things. A, he was popular enough in his form of Christianity, was popular enough to make it to the top of sort of the church in Antioch, but there was also a lot of pushback against him. He rejected a physical interpretation of the title Son of God. He believed that God is unique, and he rejected the Trinity. And now I'm going a bit into the Logos, right? So I hope most people know, but I want to give you a quick background on what the Logos is. So Logos is a Greek word with a lot of different possible translations. Now, usually, typically, when you read the Bible, it's translated as word, right? But it's not in Greek. It's not a word in the grammatical sense. That would be lexis. But it's still in philosophy, this has a long tradition. So going back in the 6th century BC and maybe even before that, it was used to mean something along the lines of reason or reasoned debate. But really, for the Christians, what become interesting for them, or actually before the Christians, it's the first one who brought this concept into the realm of sort of this Semitic landscape was Philo of Alexandria. He was a Jewish philosopher and sort of the post-child of Hellenized Judaism. And he followed these Platonic ideas of the distinction between perfect form and imperfect matter. So God is like the perfect form and earth is sort of imperfect matter. And there's a large gap in there which needs to be bridged. And for Philo, this bridge was the Logos. So that for him was the highest of the intermediary beings. So there are also angels and cherubs and but the Logos was the highest of these intermediary beings, and he called it the firstborn of God. And this Logos also acted on behalf of God in the physical world, and Philo identified it with the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament. As the angel of the Lord, Philo thought this would be the Logos. And Philo believed that the Logos was God's instrument in the creation of the universe. So some of those things might sound familiar, some maybe not so much. So obviously in Christianity, we have the Gospel of John, which starts with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And this Word is the Logos, right? So oftentimes also it's not translated at all because translating it as word is sort of limiting, right? So very often it's just, you can also read it, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And for Trinitarian Christians, the Logos is Jesus Christ, right? Or rather, Jesus Christ is the incarnate Logos. Exactly. But that's something these anti-Trinitarians would reject, right? I mean, they worked a lot with this term Logos. That's why I'm bringing it up. And we have those documents from the synods in which Paul was denunciated. So that's why we have a good idea of what he believed in. So Paul believed that the Logos is only an instrument of God. So similar to Philo, unlike Trinitarian Christians. He believed that the Logos inhabited the prophets and Jesus. So he says they dwell in them, but in Jesus, this connection was deeper than in the previous prophets. He rejected Jesus' pre-existence, so he's not the Logos incarnate. He says that Mary didn't give birth to the Logos, only to the man. Right? So he's not divine. Christ became great through wisdom, in his view. Right? So he's like us, but better in every way. And that's why this connection to the Logos was so deep within him. So, so Jesus became the Christ in Paul's view through his obedience. And by that he means through learning the scripture, through following the law, he achieves wisdom and obedience. So it's not part of his nature. It's not that he was born divine, born as the incarnate Logos. Yes. So that's sort of the gist of it. So this Logos comes up again and again. And you mentioned Arianism before. Arianism originates from the same milieu, but it's going in a slightly different direction, because what Arius did is he added a little bit Hellenism to this Syrian belief system. So for Arius, Jesus was indeed the Logos incarnate. It's just that Arius also maintained that the Logos was created, so like Philo, so that the Logos would be subordinate to God, and hence Jesus would be subordinate to God. But Paul would also reject this idea. He would say, no, Jesus is not the Logos incarnate. The Logos is sort of a tool or a force emanating from God, not like a separate entity as such, and it dwells in Jesus. So that's what Paul Samosata would believe. Now, when we look at Persia again, so there we see the Christianization. The first Christian evidence that we find in Persia is actually around Aramaic-speaking synagogues. So that's why we can sort of assume that it was the Ebionites. So those are the Christian Jews, or the Jewish Christians, whichever way you want to phrase this. So that they were the first to proselytize in Persia, but they soon sort of disappear. The bulk of Christianity in Persia comes through a trade. So along those trade routes, obviously religions typically spread, and that's also what happened here. It happens via the deportations. That's a very important part, which we talked about last time. But also by emigrated people who, like, whenever there are persecutions in Rome, people would move to Persia, basically, or at least if they live close enough to the border that it becomes feasible. Because also, if they just move over into Persia, there are also Aramaic-speaking people, right? As we've seen last time, it's one big cultural area, so it would be easy for them to move back and forth. Exactly. Now, from the 2nd century onwards, what we also see in Persia is spread of Gnosticism, which was both influenced by Hellenism and Persian tradition. So now that's something completely different. It's also technically or often under the Christian umbrella, sort of, but that's like its whole own little thing. So then in the 3rd century, Manichaeism develops in Persia. That's a synchronous religion with a lot of Gnostic influences. And it becomes sort of a main rival for Christianity for quite some time. And it actually spreads from Asia to Northern Africa and Italy. And I think that even in Spain, and they found evidence of Manichaeans. So at one point, it was really a big competitor, but then eventually it also waned away. But what's now more important for us and the development of Islam is that in the 2nd century, this radical ascetic Christian sect forms in Syria, the so-called Encratites. So they are often very anti-Jewish. They are, ascetics, so they reject the consumption of alcohol. They have very strict laws, particularly on women. So, this is a Christian sect, again, anti-Trinitarian Christian sect that forms around this time. And in that context is the Diatessaron is written. So the Diatessaron, that's a gospel. So if it's it's a narrative woven out of the 4 canonical gospels, but it's like a single narrative, and it's written in Aramaic. And for the longest time, this is the only Aramaic gospel out there. So most Aramaic-speaking Christians would use the Diatessaron for centuries. Eventually, it gets banned as heretical, and then the canonical gospels are translated into Aramaic as well. But that's still centuries away, and it only affects the Byzantine Empire, not the Persian Empire. So in Persia, the Diatessaron basically is used until the end, at least by those Syrian Christians. Now, starting to 250, the Roman Emperor Decius systematically persecutes Christians. Again, many move and flee into Persia. During the 3rd and 4th centuries, Syrian and Greek Orthodox strands become dominant. So now that's in the West, however. Right, so in the Byzantine Empire, the Syrian anti-Trinitarian Christianity sort of dies out after the Council of Nacia. For them, like after Nicaea, there's really no way to go for them. So Paul Samosata, he was still before the Council of Nacia. He could become bishop. After Nicaea, that would have been impossible, right? There's nowhere to go for them. So again, these people then move into Persia. or convert, I guess, but a lot of them move into Persia. And in the 4th century, we can really say that by now, really Christianity has established itself in Persia. We know of lots of bishops. It's still in the 4th century not as hierarchical. It's not as structured, not as fleshed out structure as in the Byzantine Empire, but it's getting there. It's getting there. Now, in 410, we have this Council of Seleucia Ctesiphon, which we've also talked about last time. And what this means is now the Church of the East is sort of officially separated from the Church in the West. Right? So it's separate, it's sphere, sort of, yeah. However, the Church of the East does adopt the Council of Nacia, which means it's Trinitarian. And that's most likely a result of the Persian Christians being a mix of Greeks and Syrians. Because with those deportations, there were also a lot of Greeks or Greek Christians being deported. And up until 410, they basically had completely separate church structures. So they were not intermingling. They had the Greeks and the Syrians in Persia had their own congregations throughout the empire. And that's obviously not something that the Persian king liked. He wanted one church for Persia, which would be sort of put in opposition to the church in the West. And this turns out to be a Syrian church, because the Syrians are the majority, but the Greeks need to be on board. So that's probably why they adopted the Council of Nacia. And also, even from the West now, in the Byzantine Empire, the Syrians already sort of were getting to the point where they were all Trinitarians. And that was also then now moving into Persia slowly. So it was just it was the smart move to do, I guess, to go Trinitarian, because that's the majority of your Christian population, but not everyone. And that's important because there were still anti-Trinitarian sects who were then very much alienated, right? So up until 410, they were just regularly doing their church service and everything. And now all of a sudden, this church organization comes in and wants to take over and tell them that they can no longer sort of live their anti-Trinitarian Christianity. So they maybe radicalize is too strong a word, but they isolate and they become resilient, if you will. So at the same time in the West, what's also important to note is that the Byzantine Church declares this Nestorianism heretical. So Nestorianism, I guess I also need to go to that real quick. So Nestorius, he postulated that you have to separate strictly between Jesus, the man, and Jesus, Son of God, basically. He says these are two separate natures which do not mix in any way. And this really escalated when he said that Mary is not the mother of God, which was like a very popular title for her at the time, but she's the mother of Christ. You can't call her mother of God. And that's what really caused big uproar. And then Nestorius was deemed a heretic, and his teachings heretical. And as it turns out, the Church of the East sort of adopted his teachings. So the Byzantine Church saw the Persian Church as heretical, but at the same time, the Byzantine Church wasn't unified either, because the monophysitism was winning over in the south. So coming from Egypt, the Egyptians were basically always monophysites, and it also caused a bit of a rift within the Byzantine Empire. And now the Western Syrians, they also become monophysites, whereas the Eastern Syrians are now mostly Nestorians, but we still have our Syrian anti-Trinitarian Christians there in between. And that's sort of the situation right when the Quran appears. And I think next time we're going to talk about that, how that happens, what informs the Quran, and what of this Syrian Christianity we can find in the Quran.
Okay, thanks so much. This is helpful. This is good. This is just putting together another piece of the puzzle, bringing it all together. And it's good what you've done. You've kind of shown where this anti-Trinitarian thread has existed all the way from the 2nd century. So this is not something that was just invented in the 4th century, and it certainly was not something that suddenly just came into being in the 7th century in that part of the world where Islam began. It's been there all the way along. That thread has existed from the very beginning. So there was, I was glad how you kind of zeroed in on Paul of Samosata out of Antioch, who was the bishop at that time, who was anti-Trinitarian. So you can see there was a strong influence of anti-Trinitarianism that was there from the 2nd century, and how that many of those that were persecuted moved over into Persia. But what was fascinating, even those who were persecuted by the Romans also moved into Persia, and that was the Trinitarian. So you had both of this mix going on up until the 7th century. And you brought this together when you showed that you have the Eastern and Western churches, that Trinitarian flavor was there, but the anti-Trinitarian flavor was there. You had the Monophysites were there. So you had all these different groups, the Nestorians, the Monophysites, and the anti-Trinitarians, all in that mix leading up into the 7th century, all in that area where Islam is now going to form. That's the soup that we're talking about, and that's the soup that makes sense. You've got to see the main players that are there. Now, it is fascinating as we're going to move on. It looks like the anti-Trinitarians are going to win out in that battle, and that's how Islam is going to form. And that's going to be the subject you're going to go into when you look at how the Quran was put together and the influences on the Quran. So that's for our next video. Thanks so much, Thomas. Good to have you back again.
Thank you.
Have you continue with this series. We'll see how people respond to it. We've got to put all these different pieces together because this is the area that most people are confused by. So I hope you're starting to see the threads. I hope you're starting to see the elements that are coming together, or I hope you're starting to see the mosaic that is.
I have one more point, or actually a question, maybe for you, or maybe for the audience. It's something that occurred to me when I was really trying to figure out a way of how to talk about the logos, right? And what occurred to me is that you could phrase it you could phrase it in a way which I hadn't thought of about before, which sort of caused me to think about something else. But okay, I'll just get into it. So the way Trinitarians would see it is like the logos is not uncreated, right? And therefore, because the logos is uncreated and God is uncreated, both have to be God, right? Because you can't have two gods. So that's sort of the reasoning for the Trinity. Whereas the anti-Trinitarians, they would reject this idea of the logos being uncreated, right? So for them, the logos is created. Okay, and then I thought, wait a minute, there's something else that's believed to be uncreated, and that's the Quran in Islam. So I was wondering, how do Muslims deal with this? The Quran being uncreated and God being uncreated. Does it mean they have two gods? Does it mean they have sort of a duality? Or how do they square this circle?
Well, that is squaring the circle. And
this seems to me exactly like what they accuse sort of Trinitarians of, like having two uncreated beings, right? But the same is true in Islam.
Yeah, and this was brought up. You mentioned in the last video, Mamun. You know, Mamun, the Mutazilites. Mutazilites bring this up. They brought this very problem. How do you have chapter 85, verse 22, chapter 85, verse 21 and 22 of the Quran, which would have been the Quran by that time in the 9th century? By that time, that verse was striking, and the Mutazilites said, "How can you have an uncreated Quran? How can you have these tablets, these preserved tablets from which the Quran is derived? How could that be uncreated? Because that creates a duality. You now have committed shirk, the unforgivable sin." And they were eradicated. And that's why they were all killed and they were destroyed. And ijtihad was then closed for 1,000 years. So that was a real problem. And it's still a problem for Muslims today. You cannot have an uncreated Quran, which means there's two uncreated beings, God himself and the Quran. One is an object and the other is God, coexisting together eternally, because there's no longer God as one. And so you can see why the very thing that the anti-Trinitarians are claiming about the logos, which is interesting because that's the same argument that Jehovah's Witnesses come up with when they look at John 1:1. They take out ho logos. They don't think that they don't know their Greek very well. Ho logos, the God, and they just make it to a God. And so in doing that, many times when you confront the Trinitarian formula, the very thing you're confronting, you then accidentally do yourself by including a verse like chapter 85, verse 22 in the Quran. Great stuff. You pulled it out. And I think that is one of the internal difficulties that many Muslims do not know how to deal with. And many of the debates on the Trinity with Muslims always zeroes in on that point of the duality that's there in the Quran itself concerning the uncreated Quran. Good stuff. Anyhow, we do need to bring this to an end.
Yeah.
But this is good for it because we are now finding that the political soup is similar to what is going on with the theological soup. Both of these milieus are percolating there in an area, and remember, an area that really had no real control. There is no Byzantine control in this part of the world in the 7th century. Heraclius, who destroyed the Sassanids, then pretty much gave it back, pulled back, and let the Arabs take over. And the Arabs are now, they have this freedom. They've been waiting for this freedom. The Arabs are both Trinitarian and anti-Trinitarian. And so now we're going to see, well, then how was the book put together? That's next. And so Thomas is going to move into that area in the next episode. Until then, get your comments below. Come back at us. Let's see what you have to say, and let's see where we go from here. God bless you. Thanks again, Thomas, for coming on board.
Thank you.
Thomas and Jay, 4,000 miles apart. Over and out.